looks good now. Welcome again. I'm going to say I'm Rob Rowan, Chair of World Affairs Council Upstate, and I'm going to be the one who introduces our speakers and moderator. So first, let me tell you about World Affairs Council Upstate, which is part of a nationwide system of organizations dedicated to engaging their communities in foreign policy, international business, and global impact issues. We are non-political and nonpartisan and strive to bring information in the most academic and unbiased manner so you can form your own opinions and ask your own questions. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we depend on your membership and donations to fulfill our mission to engage South Carolina in the world. Please, if you're not a member, consider joining or ask your business or educational institution to partner with us. You can find more information by typing World Affairs Council Upstate into your browser. And I will say, we really do need support to put on these events. And if you're enjoying them, you can become a sponsor easily, and it's not very expensive. So please consider that. Again, everybody seems to have their microphones off and their cameras off. So at this point, let me introduce our speaker, who is in Istanbul, Turkey at this point. And Chris McNaboe is a dual U.S. United Kingdom citizen who grew up in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and Kuwait. Pretty good. There we go. He spent brief periods in the U.S. while growing up due to evacuations during the Gulf War, the 1998 Indonesian Revolution, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This final evacuation became permanent when he enrolled in the University of California, Santa Cruz, to study politics and linguistics. And McNaboe attended graduate school at Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, majoring in international policy studies and conflict resolution. Chris spent some time working at as an English language teacher in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon before joining the Carter Center in 2012. In 2012, he started the Syria Conflict Mapping Project at the Carter Center, which he managed until 2018, whereupon he took on a position at the center's field officer in Beirut, Lebanon, where he was at the time of this massive explosion. And our illustrious moderator, and my good friend, Brett Nelson, he received his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin in 1989 and began teaching at Furman in January of 1990. His teaching and scholarship focused on Europe and the European Union, and he's published several books and teamed up with one of the former students, Alexander Stubb, Prime Minister of Finland. Pretty impressive. They published a textbook on the European Union. Since 2001, he has shifted his research interest to the study of religion and politics in Europe. In 2013, he was nominated by President Obama to the Corporation of Public Broadcasting Board of Directors. And at this point, I welcome everybody again, and I leave it to you, Brent, to take on this incredible story. I'm really fascinated myself to learn about this.
Thank you, Rob. That was a nice introduction, and welcome, Chris. We're glad you could stay up late for us today. So there in Istanbul. Chris has some exciting pictures and a little presentation just to hook us into this question about Lebanon and the particularly difficult position it's in these days. So Chris, welcome, and I'm going to give you opportunity to show and narrate what you're going to show us.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to virtually meet everybody on the call and get a glimpse of everyone's living rooms during this, this weird global pandemic. Just to start off, I wanted to walk people through the day of the explosion on August 4th and show a little bit of what that was like before we get into what actually brought us to that point and what we might see in the future. So I'll share my screen, please. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Okay.
Yep.
So this is just a close-up of Lebanon City, and what I've done is I've circled the blast and drawn a radius from that circle to where my old apartment was. Now, fortunately, actually for reasons relating to the Lebanese banking crisis, I had just moved out of that apartment. My fiance and I were looking to find an apartment that allowed local bank transfers. It's kind of a long story I'll get into a little bit later. But we had moved out of this apartment that I'd been in for 2 years, 2 days before the blast. And it's a very good thing that we did, because that apartment was among the very closest residential buildings to the site of the blast, just under 600 meters away. The only other residential building closer was an old building full of a couple of squatting Syrian families, actually. But just to give you a brief look, this is the blast site as seen from the top of my old building. So very, very close. Those silos that have now become famous and the crater of the blast was just a very short distance away, almost unshielded. Now the scale of this blast, as has been reported, this was the largest non-nuclear explosion of the 21st century. And it really wreaked havoc on the entire city. When it went off, I was in my new apartment, and I had thought that the apartment was hit with an airstrike. I was about 2 kilometers away, and the intensity of the blast that far away made me think that my building was about to come down. And I got alerts from everybody all over the city that they had experienced the same sort of thing, that their building had just been hit by a bomb or an airstrike or something very similar, which led everybody initially to believe that we were under attack, some sort of a coordinated artillery or aerial barrage. It wasn't until quite a bit later that we actually discovered that this was one single blast that had affected the entirety of the city. Now this devastated the entire neighborhood. As you can see here, this is one of the main streets through the neighborhood. Balconies just fell off of all the buildings around them and crushed all of the vehicles and cars nearby, a lot of people, unfortunately, as well. There was broken glass everywhere for about a mile radius. Walking down to my old apartment to find friends and neighbors, I don't think I stepped 1 foot on the ground. It was just broken glass absolutely everywhere. This is, I don't need to play this whole thing, but this is walking through the apartment after the blast. Blown out windows, window frames, mattresses, and with such force that the shards of glass in the living room, actually, if I fast forward a little bit, shot out of the windows with such force that they went through the metal on the refrigerator door. And this was a pretty standard experience for apartments all throughout Lebanon. It left about 300,000 people homeless, took approximately 200 lives, and injured upwards of 6,000 other people. So it was a truly devastating attack, or sorry, not attack. A lot of people have been calling it that, but a truly devastating blast that affected Lebanon at possibly the worst conceivable time, and will have lasting implications for the political future of Lebanon for probably a good generation. I was fortunate to be uninjured. Carter Center did ask me to evacuate to Istanbul, where I've been working ever since, out of the fear of greater political unrest and what this blast might mean for stability, security, and the ongoing COVID epidemic in Lebanon today. So with that, I'll I'll leave it and turn it over to you, Brent.
Yeah, Chris, that is, those are amazing scenes, and we are very thankful that that you escaped I guess unhurt. Even though you did have to move, which I can see why. So let's go back a little bit and give us a little sense of the historical territory that led Lebanon to this particular position. And I understand that the blast itself was not perpetrated by any one group or anything like that, but there are issues that led up to such an unstable amount of explosive being in that port. So take us through a little bit of the historical background, perhaps starting with the Civil War and then moving there, and so we can see where things stand today.
Sure. So Lebanon's civil war, well, its 15-year civil war and how it concluded in 1990 really set the stage for this event. This blast was the result of really a dysfunctional government that could not fulfill a lot of very basic services, and the groundwork for that situation was laid in what's called the Taif Agreement or Accords in 1990, which was the sort of a ceasefire agreement that ended the Lebanese Civil War. It, if I can just, well, here we go. So the Taif Agreement led to a redivision of political power in Lebanon, and it divided things up between Christians, all the various Christian sects and Muslim sects in the country, and sort of locked the political system in place. So as you can see from these screenshots that I just grabbed from Wikipedia today, before Taif, the number of Christians in the government, which was mandated by the Constitution, was greater than the number of Muslims. And with demographic changes, with major political changes throughout the region, with an exodus of Palestinian refugees and the PLO coming into Lebanon, this very fragile balance was shaken greatly, and this led to a conflict. Now, I don't want to say that this is entirely a sectarian conflict, Christian versus Muslim. There are a lot of factions at play here and a lot of different political parties, but it led to a very toxic mix of clashing ideologies, clashing sects, and regional and global involvement. Lebanese often say that everybody in the world has a hand in the Middle East, and everybody in the Middle East has a hand in Lebanon. And this was very much the case during the conflict, and really has been since. But the only agreement that could be reached to end this conflict was reached by just freezing everything in place. Between the major sects, it mandated that the president would be a Christian, the Speaker of the House would be a Shia, the Prime Minister would be Sunni, and put into government everyone that was a major militia leader during the Civil War, and they are still in government today. And while many of the aspects of the Taif Accords or the agreement were meant to be temporary, they have endured throughout. So, for example, as part of the Taif Accords, Syria, the Syrian military, which was in Lebanon at the time, was meant to leave within 2 years. Now, they stayed until 2005, and they only left Lebanon because of major popular mobilization. But still, just about every leader of all of the different military factions that existed during the Lebanese Civil War are still in place in the Lebanese government. And it's created a system of patronage to their own communities, where they divide up different spoils of the Lebanese state and pass them to their various constituents and sects who keep them in power. Everything from major graft to vote buying has been regular in Lebanon, and it's led to many just deadlocked governments. For example, in 2015 and 2016, the Lebanese state could not even pick up the trash in the capital of Beirut. They'd closed down a waste management site, and they couldn't agree on where the next one would be, and the trash just piled up on the street. The capital of Beirut has regular power cuts every day, and power is cut for at least 3 hours every day. The internet is quite poor. The infrastructure all throughout the country is quite poor, and it's simply because nobody can, that everything is locked and frozen in place from where it was in the 1990s, and political agreement on even the most basic levels has been made incredibly difficult.
So Chris, you mentioned the trash issue, and it seems like that sparked some popular unrest, which grew and grew until, I guess, basically COVID hit. So tell us a little bit about how popular movements have begun to, I don't want to say unfreeze, but maybe begin to crack some of this frozen settlement. And then also, I think this pertains to what you were doing there. So please do explain a little bit about what your job with the Carter Center was. But if you can wrap all that together, I'm not quite sure, but go ahead.
Sure. So the Carter Center doesn't currently have any ongoing activities in Lebanon. But when I first moved out in 2018, we were getting involved in order to monitor the Lebanese elections in 2018. And this was, we felt, very important for us to do because it was the first election in over 9 years. And the first one to take place in, adjacent to the ongoing Syrian conflict, in light of major regional political developments, and following the kind of awakening of a lot of civil society movements in Lebanon. There was a protest movement in 2015 and 16 called You Stink, against the politicians, against really in response to the trash crisis and other basic functioning elements of the state. That developed into a couple of smaller civil society-based political parties that have tried to, that tried to gain a seat at the table in what I have already described as is a very locked system. In the end, we didn't end up monitoring the election. We did pre-assessments, and we wrote up some thoughts and ideas on where and some potential concerns we had, such as voter education and things like this. But in the end, that election solidified the power of Hezbollah, of the Hezbollah allied political bloc that forms about half of the seats in parliament. And it only gave one seat in parliament to this nation's civil society political movement. It didn't, however, give a majority or enough of a popular mandate to really any party for them to really address a lot of these issues moving forward. So when things continued to, when things didn't improve or continued to deteriorate, the trigger for this was some new taxes that the government had implemented. They were having a bit of a currency crisis, perhaps as a result of the ascendancy of Hezbollah and Shia parties. A lot of Gulf-backed Saudi money was pulling out of Lebanon, and that led to foreign currency reserves dwindling, and some really wild interest rates that the Lebanese bank was offering to be questioned. And as the government implemented new taxes on WhatsApp, which is, I don't know whose idea that was. This is basically the only thing that all Lebanese across the political spectrum can agree that they enjoy, which is, social media. People took to the streets. They took to the streets it was October of 2019. It's just over a year now since the major protest movement started. And they took to the streets in very, very large numbers. It was a really, really optimistic period. It led to the resignation of the government. But really the only thing that everybody could agree upon, other than that they liked WhatsApp, was that they didn't like the current government. And when it came time to forming a new government or changing things, they ran into the difficulties of this locked system. And it was in that context that COVID then hit the country. Very little political progress, a lot of protests, movements going on, skyrocketing inflation, and more and more. Lebanon was already struggling, and COVID came along and kicked it while it was down. People's money was locked up in banks, and so in order to get it out of the banks, people started buying real estate, and because they had more confidence in the real estate market than in the financial market, and they worried that their assets would just disappear. And then the blast came and destroyed Lebanon's real estate. So it was really, really a perfect storm of things where, after every new thing happens, everyone would say, well, it can't get any worse than this. People have stopped saying that now because they're really afraid that it might, and it will. Yeah.
So, Chris, I have two questions. One, as I understand it, part of the problem with the frozen system is that demographics have shifted. And you're going to help me understand that. It seems to me that the Shia population has grown while the Christian population has shrunk, or at least not grown as fast. But perhaps you can help with that, because doesn't that affect the balance of political power? And I don't know if that's reflected in the elections or not, but take that one first, and I've got another follow-up.
So everybody knows that demographics have shifted a lot, but the Lebanese state has not done an official census since, I think, the 1930s maybe, really because they're afraid of what these numbers might mean. Now, speaking to some Lebanese parliamentarians, there is a little bit of seat trading going on. They'll say, well, we know that the Shia population in this area is quite a bit larger than it used to be, but also there are more Christians in this area now. So we'll give you one seat from here and you give us one seat from there. And they've just tried to do a little bit of trading on the side like that. But fundamentally, the political balance of power doesn't shift very much, or really at all. Which they used for the first time in 2018. It's very, very confusing. There's a party ranking system, but then there's also a sectarian place. So you'll have a situation where somebody doesn't get the most votes. They don't even get the second or third or fourth most votes, but because of the sect and the party list that they're running under, they will get the seat in parliament. It's a very confusing system, and very difficult to get beyond. So pressure is building from the demographics. The political system just cannot adapt to that without truly fundamental changes in reforms. People are pushing for them now, but the prospects, hope from the October 2019 protest movement has really collided in a brutal way with the difficulties of the reality of reforming the system now.
So as I understand it, the former prime minister, Hariri, is still trying to find a majority coalition of some sort. Um, I don't know if you know up to the minute what the negotiations are like, but can you bring us up to date on what it looks like? Because it looks like the same guy is going to be running the government that the protesters were protesting against.
Yes. Well, I mean, the slogan of the protesters has been "Kullun yani kullun," which means everybody means everybody. And so it's really a protest against the entire political class, of which Saad Hariri is. Saad Hariri has been and appointed as a prime minister tasked with forming a government. But this would be the third attempt at forming a government in the past year, and it's really only gotten more difficult. There was some hope, actually, that the dire situation that Lebanon had found itself in might allow for some change, because the current situation cannot continue. Inflation is out of control. There's a shortage of basic goods. There's now shortage of crucial medical capacity for dealing with COVID, combined with now the blast and the damage that it's caused. And the blast is estimated to have caused somewhere between 6.6 and 8.1 billion dollars in damage. And this is at a time when the coffers are completely empty. So if Lebanon is so desperate for foreign aid, perhaps foreign countries that are interested in seeing some reform or positive changes in Lebanon would have the leverage that they haven't had in the past to really make people sit down and make some tough choices and some reforms. France has tried to do that. The French initiative after the blast. But as these governments have tried to form, the United States has come in and sanctioned some individuals from the Hezbollah side of the government twice now, which have really complicated the formation of a unity government and exacerbated political divisions in the country now. So yes, people aren't very excited to see Hariri again. He's sort of the lowest common denominator that everybody could agree to again. But his prospects of forming a more technocratic, independent unity government, which has the executive power in the Lebanese constitution, the Council of Ministers does, is now greatly limited by increasing political divides. And all in a climate of just continuous petty political squabbles.
So you've opened the door to our talking about foreign influence in Lebanon. It's, of course, in a very strategic spot. And you have Iran with interests there. You have Israel with interests there, Saudi Arabia, Syria in the past. They've got their own problems, but they may, to my knowledge, I don't know if they're still meddling or not. But and then you have the Western powers. You've mentioned France being an important one. So yeah, walk us through all of those interests and who's tied to whom and how that might work out in the future.
Yeah, so the foreign influence in Lebanon has been continuous. I mean, dating back to the beginning of Lebanon as a somewhat distinct political entity under the Ottoman Empire, where France came in and began their relationship with Lebanon. For a long time, the influence of foreign actors, particularly regional foreign actors, have balanced things in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia was very involved, and they were a major financial backer of the Sunni political blocs in Lebanon, particularly Saad Hariri in the Future Movement. Iran has maintained a very big presence in Lebanon since the civil war, when they backed the formation of Hezbollah as sort of an export of their revolutionary ideologies. Now, Hezbollah is very much a Lebanese organization, despite this initial impetus for its creation coming from Iran. But for a long time, neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia wanted to see Lebanon fail. The United States and European governments as well, all of the neighbors didn't want to see any sort of a collapse. Foreign aid has always been in support of various political factions. And that's allowed Lebanon to get by without reforming for a very long time. They get a lot of foreign support, and the foreign support just keeps coming, and they just keep going on. Now, I mentioned the 2018 election a little bit. That tipped the scales a bit more in favor of Iran, and it has disrupted a lot of this foreign engagement. Saudi Arabia and Gulf Arabs have not invested in Lebanon as much as they had in the past. There was a huge capital flight at the first hints of some trouble, and there's also a question when it comes to the West of engagement in the region in general, and the utility of engaging in Lebanon. For example, a conversation I was having with a European diplomat back in 2018, around the time of the election, is that they were saying, okay, well, Lebanon has had a pro-US prime minister in Saad Hariri for a very long time. But as the United States continues to disengage from the region, as they're moving out of Iraq, as they, under the Obama administration, if they were interventionists, they were very reluctant interventionists. And if Russia is becoming an increasingly greater power within the Middle East since their intervention in 2015 in Syria, then at what point you have to question what the utility of having a pro-United States prime minister is. And so there have been some of these questions asked around in Lebanon today, but I don't really know yet what this will mean for the future. The United States under the Trump administration has written off Lebanon, or they seem to, and have included it in part of their maximum pressure campaign on both Iran and on Syria. Syria and Lebanon are intimately tied. As you mentioned, Syria has had a role in Lebanon up until 2005, and you can be sure that presence and influence did not just vanish in 2005. For example, when the Lebanese crisis, the financial crisis started, it spilled over into Syria. About 25% of all assets, financial assets in Lebanon, are owned by Syrians, and now they're locked and frozen and are rapidly devaluating, which has led to a currency crisis and massive inflation and basic shortages of basic goods in Syria. So the question then becomes, what does this international engagement look like? Who actually has an incentive to prevent Lebanon from failing, or do some countries even have an incentive to allow it to fail as part of a maximum pressure campaign? Now that we are, the United States is changing administrations, that will be a big open question moving forward, and as well as a question of whether the U.S. will have much or the incoming Biden administration will have much leeway to form their own policies with regards to Lebanon, or if they will find themselves on a predetermined path because of the number of individuals that have already been sanctioned by the outgoing administration, which is something that's very, very hard for any administration to undo. So it's very tough. I think the major political bloc that has a prolonged interest in seeing the stability of Lebanon is Europe at this moment. They don't want to see another exodus of refugees, and there will certainly be an exodus of refugees from Lebanon if the financial crisis continues to deteriorate. There have already been an increase in people taking boats to Cyprus, and this this sort of a trend will only increase if basic goods and services cannot be secured, or if the political deadlock causes a larger break or crumble that affects Lebanese security.
So that actually brings Turkey into the picture, doesn't it? If you have refugees going over the northern border, which could only exacerbate what is already a difficult situation in southern Turkey. Do you think there was a time, and I'm old enough to remember this, that it looked like Lebanon might get carved up, at least in a de facto way? Israel was sort of took a buffer zone, and Syria had its chunk. That seems to have been put on the back burner, I guess, by some of these local regional powers. But could there be a kind of, I guess, de facto carving up with the powers taking a sort of region, local area within Lebanon and saying, okay, this is what we control? Maybe the Western powers taking Beirut and trying to bring some stability there, or doesn't that seem to be a possibility at this point?
I don't think that a carving up of Lebanon would be in the cards or any possibility. It's a very, very small country as it is, and the sectarian makeup and political divisions of the country are scattered all over the place. There's no clear region that, even if it wanted to, could easily separate itself out from anywhere else. So I don't think that is the case. You did mention Turkey. Turkey has been somewhat flexing its influence throughout the region. They've had a pivot to focus more on the Middle East lately, and there's some talk of increasing Turkish influence in the heavily Sunni northern city of Tripoli, which is Lebanon's second largest city. Turkey also has a major interest, as do all of the neighboring countries, in offshore gas fields. Gas fields were discovered in, I think it was 2010, maybe 2011, with initial estimates stating that the amount of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean is enough to satisfy all of the domestic energy needs of surrounding countries, including Israel, Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria, and possibly even southern Turkey, and turn them into exporters, which is a major, major economic boon for these countries. And now since 2011, there have been negotiations regarding the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon, trying to get ahead of any potential conflict in this area. But conflict appears to be coming regardless. There are increasingly tense standoffs between Turkish and Greek ships around Cyprus. President Erdogan from Turkey just made a visit to northern Cyprus and is calling for a separation of that state. I don't think Lebanon will fall into separating its state up into anything else, but I do think that this major prize of a huge amount of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean will motivate a lot of people to pressure domestic Lebanese politics in one direction or another.
Okay, well, let me indicate to everyone out there that you can use the chat function to ask questions of Chris, and we've got a number in the chat function already, so let me begin to give you some sense of what people are thinking about. First of all, there are a couple of questions here about Hezbollah, and let's see. So, how strong is Hezbollah within the Lebanese population? And you mentioned that American sanctions against Hezbollah spoiled attempts to form a new Lebanese government. What approach should the Biden administration take, in your view, bearing in mind the national security issues and interests?
That's a very good question. First, on the Hezbollah side of things, Hezbollah is a very major force in Lebanon. They were under the Taif Agreement, they were the only armed faction within Lebanon that was allowed to keep their arms, which has given them outsized, oversized influence ever since. But they are the largest political and military party associated with the fastest growing demographic in Lebanon, which is the Shia population, who have been historically excluded from politics. So there was a lot of Shia revivalism or just a big surge in political power and engagement since the Lebanese Civil War. They can, if they want to, flex their muscles and take over the country. Or they did in 2008. They, in a matter of hours, took over the capital of Beirut because of a dispute then. And I don't think that their power has greatly diminished. They have been weakened somewhat by fighting in Syria, but they've also at the same time been battle hardened. And there aren't many, there are no military rivals to them in Lebanon other than the Lebanese military itself. And when it comes to political, which is the Lebanese military has been supported by Western funders as a counterweight to Hezbollah. But politically, they're still a very, very powerful, very, very powerful group. In addition to their political and military power, they have built schools, they have scouts, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. They have water distribution for clean drinking water to a lot of their areas. They build health clinics. They are a state within a state, with all of the services and features and even the military to go with it. So I don't think I can underestimate or understate their power and influence in Lebanese politics. Now, the second question, what approach should Biden's administration take? I think that from the U.S. perspective, Lebanon is not very important. It's relatively small. The United States doesn't really have much of a stake in these gas fields. I think the U.S. should focus on Lebanon as from perhaps a conflict resolution perspective. The U.S. has a very close ally in Israel to the south, and they have been engaging on maritime border negotiations. I think they should continue to do what they can to prevent any regional conflict in that region. They will inevitably tie Lebanon to their Syria policy because the countries are very closely connected, and to their Iranian policy. But when it comes to dealing with this current pressing political crisis and financial crisis, I think that the United States would do well to back up the Europeans and follow the Europeans' lead when it comes to Lebanon. I think that this can ensure that there aren't too many cooks in the kitchen, and can have the dual benefit of beginning to patch up multilateralism and the U.S.-European, U.S.-NATO relation in moving forward. And that's, I say NATO in addition to U.S.-European because Turkey is a major player in this as well, and Turkish-European relations have been strained greatly. So I think if the Biden administration wants to be productive in Lebanon, they'll back the current French initiative at forming a reform-oriented government and try to positively engage on maritime disputes related to the gas fields to prevent a greater outbreak of conflict or contentious relations between Europe and Turkey, and between and among all of the Eastern Mediterranean countries.
So here are a couple of economic questions. One of them has to do with the current economic crisis. And one good question here is, has crime increased? I mean, are people hoarding cash and then stealing from one another? What is there much of a police force left? Those kinds of things. So how dangerous is it to be a citizen there?
Crime has greatly increased. Across just about all metrics, crime is up. I forget the exact percentage, but it's steadily risen over the past year. And there have been recently more alarming rises in crime. So for the past month or two, there have been a lot of armed carjackings. But interestingly, they're armed carjackings of rental vehicles, which is perhaps the most polite demographic to target, because clearly these are people that haven't been, they're targeting people that clearly have not been too affected by the economic crisis. But this is a very clear sign of rising desperation amongst a lot of people in Lebanon. There are more kind of drive-by purse snatches and things like this, and break-ins and robberies. But it's not total anarchy yet. This is a big question that I've been facing myself. You know, I left after the blast, and the Carter Center's been wondering whether or not I should return to Beirut. We held off for the fall because of the ongoing pandemic, but we're just now deciding, and it's leaning towards, yes, I think it's safe enough for me to go back there and live. It is, by all accounts, a changed and depressed city, at least Beirut, but the rest of the country as well, because those restaurants and businesses that survived the financial crisis were destroyed in the blast, and now are closing again because of a worsening crisis. So it's you know, empty streets and a lot of unemployed people.
Do you see any chance of Beirut returning to its position as like the jewel of the Mediterranean anytime soon?
I really don't. I mean, already the city was scattered with buildings that had never been repaired since the days of the Civil War. And now it's just, the skyline has quite a few more missing teeth after the blast, with a really, you know, it's not exactly a great environment for investing. I don't know anybody that wants to go long on the Lebanese lira or invest in anything major in the country at the moment. So it's going to be a very long time before it really it could get back to its glory days. There's real potential there. There's incredible potential in Lebanon. It's a very, very highly educated population. It's a beautiful geographic country, and has, I will say, objectively some of the greatest food in the world, and a very friendly cosmopolitan population. You know, it's got a lot going for it, but it needs it needs to break from a lot of the self-imposed restraints that have been wrapped around it since the Civil War, to move beyond the political deadlock that it's facing right now.
Okay, back to foreign policy. Well, okay, so one question about Israel's recent Abraham Accords. How does that affect Lebanon? And then also, has there been any involvement by the United Nations? So take those two.
Sure. The Abraham Accords, I don't think the Abraham Accords really changed very much. The Abraham Accords have made overt what has always been kind of commonly understood with regards to regional politics. People aren't happy with it. I mean, I can think of no other country that has done more harm to Lebanon than, you know, the various conflicts that they have been in. And so the Lebanese population is quite uniformly opposed to Israel and doesn't like to see people reconciling with them. There was a lot of grumbling that their government was even meeting with Israeli officials for these maritime border demarcations. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think the Abraham Accords will really do very much to affect the politics of Lebanon. When it comes to the United Nations, the UN has always played a large role in Lebanon. The UNRWA, UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, manages a lot of camps and deals with the many Palestinian refugees that have been in Lebanon since 1948 and the 70s. The UN also has a mission along the southern border in Lebanon, where they police a demilitarized zone between the Israeli and Lebanese borders. And increasingly, they have been conducting local aid operations. There's a large number of international NGOs that provide food security aid and things like this, and the UN is a major player in that broader community.
A couple of, I guess, thoughts about sectarian divisions. There's one question here about the French. Do they always side with the Roman Catholic segment? Now, my understanding of Lebanon is that they don't have a large Roman Catholic, but it's Maronite Catholics. So
Maronite. Yeah, so there are Maronites and there are Orthodox, a lot of different Christian factions there. France has had a historic relationship with the Maronites, which are, by order of the Vatican, Catholics again, despite the fact that they were actually, they split from the church early on because of some debate that I am not informed enough to comment on. But France's initial relationship in Lebanon was with the Christian, primarily Maronite community, which is the largest Christian community in Lebanon. And it's continued since then. I mean, but now the political blocs, I mean, the Maronites and the Christians in Lebanon are divided. There's a very large Christian party that is in a coalition with Hezbollah and Amal, the two main Shia groups. Other Christian groups are siding with the Future Movement in South Haiti, and the Progressive Socialist Party, which is the Druze Party, which is another kind of subsect of Islam. So it's mainly just a political question at this point, and I wouldn't call it sectarian. There's a lot of Christian political alliances as it comes to sects, religious sects in Lebanon are exactly reversed from what they are in Syria, neighboring Syria. So it really just comes down to political questions, and I think that will guide France's engagement more than any sectarian considerations.
Will the crisis in Lebanon affect the war in Syria?
Yes, and it has. Interestingly, at the outset of this, avoided, but the Lebanese financial crisis has greatly spilled over into Syria. Parallel spikes in inflation of the Syrian, as it has with the Lebanese pound. As I said, it's locked up a lot of Syrian assets within Lebanon. It's prevented remittances from the Syrian diaspora from reaching Syrians. They cannot because of sanctions banked directly with Syria, but everybody was going through Lebanon. And now with the Lebanese banks collapsing, they can't do that as well. And so there's great fear that this Lebanese crisis now will lead to further immiseration of the Syrian population, perhaps an economic-driven exodus of refugees, similar to what we saw because of the conflict-driven exodus. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety when looking at the Lebanese crisis, and I've even suggested to some countries that if they're looking to positively to help out Syrian civilians, but they don't want to engage with the Syrian government, then they should look to Lebanon to see if they can't stabilize things in Lebanon and thus indirectly help people in Syria. The two countries are very, very closely linked with each other, and I think their futures will be as well.
Okay, one final question here. The U.S. is building a $2 billion embassy. Why? Is that true? And
I was not aware of that. I don't know. To be honest, I rarely go and visit the U.S. diplomats at the embassy in Beirut. They're far outside of town. They're largely removed from the conversation. They have curfews and things, and honestly, I haven't found them to be particularly engaged or informed. My understanding is their presence in Hezbollah and Israel, and I don't know of any plans for.
You broke up a little bit there at the end, at least on my end, but I think we got the gist. So let's wrap this up. Just finish up by giving us what you envision the short-term future for Lebanon is, and then what's the long-term future?
Whew. I mean, the short-term future for Lebanon, I don't see any drastic positive changes taking place. I think it's necessary that we see some political reform, or perhaps a unity technocratic government being formed in the next 6 to 8 months. And if that is not formed, then I think things could steadily go downhill. This is, from a personal perspective, this is something that I've been asking myself when discussing a return to Lebanon. And I feel perfectly comfortable and fine going back to Lebanon for the next 6 to 12 months. But beyond, actually, in the latter half of that next year, I would worry that if a breakthrough is not reached, the crisis will continue, and these kind of more friendly carjackings that we've seen will start to turn. The population will start to turn more and more desperate. It's worrying to look at just how dire the situation is, with financial crisis combined with COVID, combined with the blast, combined with increasing political polarization. We need to start dismantling this pile of unfortunate events if Lebanon is going to pull up from the nosedive that it's currently in. As I said, the country has incredible potential. It has an amazingly large and influential diaspora throughout the world. There are a lot of people that want to see this country get out of the current crisis that it's in, and there are a lot of countries that are rooting for it to get out of that current crisis as well. Lebanon will need an international helping hand to move beyond this, but it has to take the first step itself and come up with some concrete reforms in order to get that international aid and pull it forward. Hopefully it will. As I said, the international community has greater leverage now than it ever has before because of how dire the situation is. There's a lot of hope and optimism around the potential use of these offshore gas reserves to fund reconstruction and rehabilitation of basic services in Lebanon. But a lot of things need to align in the right way for that to be a good path forward. And let's hope that they're able to take that first step, and we can start to rebuild.
Well, let's end on that optimistic note. And I just want to thank you, Chris, for being such a well-informed and and delightful guests to have on, talk about this tough situation. And besides all of that, you have just got a great mustache. And
Well,
someday it's going to look like mine if you keep it.
I can only hope. I can only hope. I was glad to see that
Yeah.
the moderator of this discussion would be a fellow mustachio.
And I'm so glad to see, it come back. So I'm not just a throwback anymore. I'm on the cutting edge. If you get long enough, if you get old enough, you're back to being on the cutting edge. All right, I've got a little something to read as we end up here. The World Affairs Council Upstate wants to thank Chris McNaboe for sharing his experience with us today. We are so glad you were able to join us and hope you will attend our first in-person event and this is for everybody, to our America and the World Conversation series that starts in January 2021. The event will take place in the Kroc Center, but will also be live streamed. Details and registration for the event will be available soon on our website at upstateinternational.org. I want to thank all of you who took time out of your day to learn something about a very important and difficult part of the world. And we look forward to seeing you very, very soon at one of our next events. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We'll just stay on for a bit here. Ooh, that's cool. I like that screen share, Kim.